Hi, my name is Kristen Hubers, and I teach high school social studies in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Jenna asked me to talk about literacy in the social studies classroom and really look at this idea of differentiation. So here's how I approach literacy in the social studies classroom. I use literacy and teach literacy through the history standards, because I teach US history and AP government, through the history standards of continuity and change over time, with also prediction making and tying to past events, so precedent. And so literacy education really fits well within that idea. So especially within United States history, where if we're talking about currently we're talking about Islamophobia after 9/11, being able to bring a news article in from today, an opinion piece about this idea of Asian hate that's coming and stemming from COVID backlash, is really useful. So when you set up a piece of literacy in the social studies classroom, I tend to go toward more current events and more opinion pieces within the newspaper. So how are they going to use their history education in high school in order to be better citizens and adults? And that is decoding and understanding and connecting current events to maybe lessons we learned from history. So what's changed and what's the same? So Mark Twain, my favorite quote, and I use it with my kids all the time, is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So if we're looking for the exact same thing to happen currently as happened in history, we're never going to be able to use the stuff that we learned from history, because it's not going to be the exact same. So the kids have to be able to learn what is the same, what is different, and then how does that change how I'm going to react, how I'm going to fix a problem. And so I always approach a literacy lesson, or whatever you want to call it, an extension piece, that continuity and change piece, with a question. And it is a no right answer question. So with the Asian hate one, is what can we do to stop the hate crimes that are happening against Asian Americans, using what we know from the Islamophobia, or what we know if we're doing something from the Japanese internment camps from World War II. And so that's kind of the stem in which it goes. So they have to connect that changing continuity, and then they have to make a prediction. So what do they think is going to happen? How do they think our leaders, how do they think Americans are going to, respond to this event, respond to this idea of Asian and Pacific Islander hate that's coming out of COVID? And so Jenna really asked me to talk to you about differentiation within the social studies classroom. And so there's kind of two ways to do that, because social studies writing is very straightforward. It's not pretty. It's not flowery. It is an argumentative essay. You pound your reader with your evidence, your reasoning. You connect it so thoughtfully that they have no choice but to walk away from your reading going, bam, that's what they meant. That's what I agree with. So you should always have that drop the mic moment, where you definitely prove your point. You don't leave anything up for literary, interpretation. And so it's very much a claim, evidence, reasoning, counter argument, rebuttal, drop that mic, and you're good to go. And so but that's really easy then to differentiate. So there's kind of two ways to do that. One, I use a lot of since I use a lot of news articles, I use a lot of pieces from like student news organizations. So Upfront News article, things like that, where you can differentiate the lexiles. And so if you're just asking them to understand the information and then tie it back, you could adjust those lexile scores. Because I do team teach. I do teach 2 sections of a team talk class, where a third of my kids in each section have IEPs. And so that's really helpful with that. Also, there's a different way to do it, and that is if you have one level text, even if it's 2 quote unquote simple for, let's say, your grade level, like if it's at a 6th grade level and I teach 10th grade US history, I will sometimes up the level of what I'm asking them to do. And so maybe it's an extension of like the claim, right? Maybe it is like one instance is when Jenna and I were teaching 9th graders about discrimination and prejudice and differentiating between the two. We had our really, really high achieving kids that who wanted to push themselves to identify not just the instances of discrimination, but which of those instances of discrimination led to acts of prejudice. Within my human geography class, we were talking about prejudice and discrimination. And so we had them do an extra thing, push themselves. And then their evidence had to be more tied to, well, this is an act of discrimination. Here's how I know that, evidence reasoning. And then this is going to lead to, or this is an act of prejudice. This is how I know that, why. And then this led directly to this act of discrimination because. So tying that back, where we as just to meet the standard, the kids had to identify, exemplify, and reason acts of prejudice. And so it's kind of that extra. So if you have the same level of text, that is one way to differentiate within that as well. Or instead of having them do 2 pieces of evidence, you have your really kids that want to, reach a little bit higher. You can push them a little bit higher, differentiate, and have them do 3 pieces of evidence. And another way that I do that within my U.S. history class, because I give all of the kids, if it's like an opinion piece that's not a student news piece, I give them different levels of questions. So they all have to answer this one question. And then if you want to push yourself, and so I'll tell my kids, I need you to answer this question too. I need you to extend it. I need you to make that prediction. I need you to tie that back to all historical context that we've talked about this year, not just Islamophobia after 9/11. Can you go back to what we've studied this whole year? Can you tie it back to McCarthyism? Even though that might be kind of a stretch, you could talk about, what is that continuity? What is that change? And so I have to say that I've learned so much about literacy education and not just using literacy to get me to my end goal of social studies standards, but also being very explicit and using social studies standards and literacy standards to allow me to really give these kids something that they're going to use in their future. So maybe they won't necessarily remember Japanese internment camps, but they will remember and they will know how to critically read a opinion piece in the newspaper when they're 30 years old and, figure out, do you agree? Do you disagree? Are you going to be swayed, or are you going to use your critical thinking skills in order to make your own opinion? And so literacy education to me is about preparing them to use those social studies skills that they learned in the real world when they're older. Have fun. You'll learn a lot. And, just figure out some ways to implement them in your classroom. I have seen kids really enjoy that aspect of it. So it's bringing this, it is allowing them to understand the world around them. And I think that's kind of what they really want. They want some control and understanding of the world around them. If you need anything, reach out.